Remember, there was not a church prior to the New Testament. The Jews had the synagogue. The church was something new. So they didn't really know how to do it. So they had allowed the entire world system in which they exited or infiltrated their assembly. What they did was they infiltrated their church. In other words, they brought into the church. They brought into the church the world system. They were emphasizing human philosophy. In other words, they began to think, what is society saying in how to build a church? We're in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. So the Corinthians were saying, let's go study what the world's doing in order to build God's church. And that's understandable because they didn't have the New Testament. So they brought in world philosophy into their church. And thirdly, they had as heroes worship cults. Now you have to remember that Gentiles, boy, it's nice standing right here where the people are. Gentiles, get that there. Gentiles, you remember, were pagans. Gentiles were pagans. And as pagans, they worshiped paganism. During the process, they became Christians. Now when you become a Christian, out of the world, you still bring into your life paganism. Paganism is anything that's not Christian. So many Christians get saved then, but they still had connections with paganism. So they brought paganism philosophy into the church. And the church was beginning to look more like paganism than Christian. And Paul's addressing that issue. They were involved in terrible, gross sexual immorality. The Corinthian church in Paul's day were involved in immoral, gross, sexual immortality. We see it in chapters 5 and 6 of 1 Corinthians. And Paul had to deal with that. Then they were misevaluated. They misunderstood their home and their marriage relationship. You remember that they married 10 to 15 times if they had a right deal. If, let's say, that Pauline was married and she burnt the toast, her husband could divorce her legally. So in order to get rid of your wife, if she did something wrong, they could divorce you, because you had to be married, but you could be divorced if you came up with a legitimate reason like burning the toast. And so they were married 10 or 15 times. Well, they brought that philosophy into the church. And the people in the church were having a misguided understanding of what God said about marriage and divorce. It's in chapter 7. Paul dealt with that. Then they were confused about pagan feasts and idolaters, and they were turning things over to idols, and they were bringing idols into the church and worshiping them, and that's in chapter 8 through 10, and Paul had to deal with that. I mean, this was a Christian church who were Christians who were misunderstanding God's program for the church. They had relinquished the proper place of women in the church. Verse 11. Women get saved a lot faster than men. And the women were coming into the church, and they were taking over the church. They were usurping the authority of the man because they were probably dumb and lazy. And so Paul writes a whole chapter on chapter 11, the place of the woman in the church. And I'll tell you what, we have screwed that up too.
Yep.
In this age. Nevertheless, they really messed up. Then they misunderstood the whole dimension of gifts. Chapter 12. In chapter 12, Paul had to write a whole brand new chapter on how to deal with gifts. They had taken the gift that God gave them and just messed it up. They were interpreting the way they wanted to interpret it. They were exercising the way they wanted to exercise it. They did what was right in their own eyes. And Paul comes in and says, man, this church is really a mess. Then they misunderstood. They lost hold of one great thing. Chapter 13, the thing that they did was they lost their first love. They lost the love that they should have had for Jesus Christ. They lost their love for their neighbors and other Christians. And Paul writes 1 Corinthians 13. And it's interesting that somehow we tend to go to chapter 13 when we misunderstand all the other chapters. We're just as messed up on marriage and remarriage. We're just as messed up on tongues. We're messed up on immorality and sex. We are so messed up on human philosophy. But we always go to Romans 13. That's way down in chapter 13. Then they misunderstood this matter of tongues. The satanic system that existed in their society infiltrated the church, and came with it pagan religion practices, and it was just, the church looked like a bunch of Indians running around in a circle. And that's about how we act today. I saw a video yesterday of the practice of some charismatic churches rolling on the floor. I remember when my dad, we built a church, and we did lose a church. We went somewhere, went to another part of town. And I went that Sunday, we sold it to a Church of God. And for the first time in 1950, probably 7, I saw my first experience of worshiping of the Church of God people. The church seated about 350 people and had a long aisle down the front. I saw people get started about and somersault, roll down, flip over all the way down to the altar. I couldn't figure out why they did that. You know, as a 7-year-old, I was confused about how that was worship. So the church brought in pagan kind of worship. They adopted pagan worship. Tongues is paganism. The Roman Greek world had multitudes of gods. An unconscious state where all kinds of psychic phenomena would occur. You know, that's like taking marijuana or drugs or cocaine. You end up having flashes. I haven't tried it lately, but you know, that's what they did in the 60s. They took marijuana so they could go in and go out of their minds. They enjoyed that. In and out of mind state was happening in the Corinthian church in 60 A.D. Some things just come around and go around, and they become same thing today.
Same thing.
Why don't we learn? In and out of mind state, one could communicate with the deity. So when they went out of their mind, they could communicate with one of their gods. Then they would commune by speaking in a language to the gods. Pagans, that is unsaved people, in a pagan world, if you're not a Christian, you're a pagan. If you're not a Christian, you're a pagan. I'll suggest you say that to people today, but if you're not a Christian, you're a pagan. A pagan is a person who lives by the world standards. So these could be pagans are everyday people. They have adopted the world's view rather than the Christian point of view. That's all I'm saying. It's not a negative word. It is a negative term to some degree. The term tongues, Glossaia, Glossaia, used by the Roman Greeks to speak in a pagan language of God, which occurred while the speaker was in the ecstatic trance, and language of the gods was always gibberish. That happened in the pagan world. That was in the pagan world. That was in the regular world. That was in the Roman world. Now, the Greek had a word for this religion experience. The word was eros. Eros, translated sensual love, meaning the desire for a sensual, meaning a desire for the ultimate experience. It was a religion passion designed to be felt. So they wanted to feel their religion. They wanted to feel their experience. And the more they could feel their experience, the greater they felt their experience as a religious person. In the temple, they would enter into orgies with the temple priestess. So when they would go into the temple that was established to be a church, they had priestesses. It was a whorehouse in our modern day terms. The priestess would be like call girls today. And when you went into the temple, you actually could have sexual relationships with them. May I say, in